A black nurse named Grace faces constant humiliation from the racist Dr. Mason. But when an unexpected crisis hits, what she does next is unbelievable. As the tables turn in ways no one could have predicted, will this be the moment that changes everything? Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. And if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. Grace Harper walked through the sliding doors of St. Michael's Hospital, her head held high despite the weight on her shoulders. The pristine white walls and bustling corridors were as familiar to her as her own home, but lately they felt more like a battleground than a place of healing. As she approached the nurse's station, Grace's colleague Sarah greeted her with a warm smile. "Morning, Grace. Ready for another day?" Grace nodded, forcing a cheerful expression. "Always ready to help our patients, Sarah." Just then, Dr. Andrew Mason strode past, his white coat billowing behind him. He barely glanced at Grace, but his lip curled in a subtle sneer. "Nurse Harper, I hope you've managed to get my patient files in order this time. We can't afford any more of your mistakes." Grace felt her cheeks burn, but she kept her voice steady. "Of course, Dr. Mason. Everything is prepared for your rounds." Dr. Mason's eyes narrowed. "It better be. We can't have your kind holding us back, now can we?" The words stung, but Grace refused to let it show. She'd heard worse from him before. Instead, she focused on organizing the charts, her fingers moving swiftly and surely. As the morning progressed, Grace found herself assisting Dr. Mason during his rounds. She stood quietly, taking notes and answering questions when asked. But with each patient, Dr. Mason seemed to find new ways to belittle her. "Nurse Harper, do try to keep up," he snapped as they moved between rooms. "I know your people aren't known for their quick thinking, but do make an effort." Grace bit her lip, her heart heavy. She wanted to speak up, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she channeled her energy into caring for her patients, offering them warm smiles and gentle touches that Dr. Mason seemed incapable of providing. As they finished the rounds, Dr. Mason turned to the group of interns following them. "Take note, everyone. Precision and intelligence are key in this profession. We can't all rely on affirmative action to get us through the door." The interns shifted uncomfortably, a few casting sympathetic glances at Grace. But no one spoke up. The silence was deafening. Grace took a deep breath, her hands shaking slightly as she clutched her clipboard. Despite the daily humiliation, she reminded herself why she was here. It wasn't about Dr. Mason or his cruel words. It was about the patients who needed her care and compassion. With that thought, Grace straightened her back and walked towards her next patient's room. She had work to do, lives to touch, and nothing, not even Dr. Mason's racism, would stop her from doing what she loved. As the afternoon sun streamed through the hospital windows, Grace found herself in room 302, tending to Mrs. Johnson, an elderly patient recovering from hip surgery. With gentle hands and a warm smile, Grace checked Mrs. Johnson's vitals and adjusted her pillows. "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Johnson?" Grace asked, her voice soft and caring. Mrs. Johnson smiled weakly. "Much better, dear. You have such a healing touch." Just as Grace was about to respond, Dr. Mason burst into the room, a scowl etched on his face. "Nurse Harper, what are you doing wasting time chatting? We have work to do." Grace straightened up, her face composed despite the sudden intrusion. "I was just checking on Mrs. Johnson's comfort, Doctor." Dr. Mason sneered. "Comfort? We're here to heal, not run a hotel. Now, what are her latest stats?" As Grace began to report Mrs. Johnson's vitals, Dr. Mason interrupted her repeatedly, his voice growing louder with each interjection. A small crowd of interns and nurses gathered at the door, drawn by the commotion. "For heaven's sake, can't you even read a simple chart correctly?" Dr. Mason bellowed, snatching the clipboard from Grace's hands. He turned to the onlookers, his face red with anger. "This is what happens when we lower our standards. Incompetence runs rampant." Grace felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she stood tall, her eyes fixed on a point just over Dr. Mason's shoulder. She could feel the sympathetic gazes of her colleagues, but no one dared to speak up. Mrs. Johnson, distressed by the scene unfolding before her, reached out and grasped Grace's hand. "Nurse Harper has been nothing but kind and professional," she said, her voice quavering. Dr. Mason barely spared the patient a glance. "With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, you're not qualified to judge medical competence." He turned back to Grace, his voice dripping with disdain. "I want a full report on my desk in an hour. Try not to mess that up too." As he stormed out of the room, the gathered staff quickly dispersed, leaving Grace alone with Mrs. Johnson. The elderly woman squeezed Grace's hand. "I'm so sorry, dear. You don't deserve that." Grace managed a small smile, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "It's all right, Mrs. Johnson. Let's focus on getting you better, shall we?" As she continued her rounds, Grace's colleagues shot her pitying looks, but no one approached her. She could hear whispers behind her back, feel the weight of unspoken words. But Grace held her head high, channeling her pain into even more attentive care for her patients. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Grace finally left the hospital, her shoulders sagging with the weight of the day. She drove home in silence, her mind replaying Dr. Mason's harsh words. But as she pulled into her driveway, the sight of her modest family home brought a small smile to her face. Inside, the aroma of her mother's cooking filled the air. Grace's parents, Robert and Evelyn, were already seated at the dinner table waiting for her. "There's our girl," Robert said, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "How was your day, sweetheart?" Grace hesitated, not wanting to burden them with her troubles. But Evelyn, ever perceptive, noticed the shadow in her daughter's eyes. "Another rough day with that doctor?" she asked gently. Grace nodded, sinking into a chair. "It's just so hard sometimes," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Robert reached across the table, clasping her hand. "You're stronger than you know, Gracie. Remember what we always taught you?" "Kindness in the face of cruelty," Grace recited, a ghost of a smile touching her lips. "Strength in adversity." Evelyn nodded, her eyes shining with pride. "That's right. Your father and I didn't have it easy either, but we never let the world's darkness dim our light." As they ate, Grace found herself transported back to her childhood. She remembered her father coming home from long shifts at the factory, exhausted but never too tired to help her with homework. She recalled her mother's unwavering optimism, even when money was tight and opportunities seemed scarce. "You know," Robert said, breaking into her thoughts, "your great-grandmother used to say, 'A kind heart is a lantern in the dark.' You've got the brightest lantern I've ever seen, Gracie." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, but for the first time that day, they were tears of gratitude. "I just wish I could make him see me as a person, not just—" "Honey," Evelyn interrupted gently, "you can't control how others see you, but you can control how you see yourself. And we see a strong, compassionate woman who makes a difference every single day." As the evening wore on, surrounded by the love and support of her family, Grace felt her spirit lifting. She knew tomorrow would bring new challenges, but here, in this moment, she found the strength to face them. The next morning, Grace arrived at the hospital, her resolve renewed by her family's support. She walked down the sterile hallway, her shoes squeaking softly on the polished floor. As she approached the nurse's station, she heard Dr. Mason's voice drifting from around the corner. "I don't know why they keep her around," Dr. Mason was saying, his tone dripping with disdain. "It's not like she adds any value here. Probably just filling some diversity quota." Grace froze, her hand clutching her clipboard so tightly her knuckles turned white. The words cut deep, each one a sharp knife twisting in her heart. She took a shaky breath, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. For a moment, she considered turning the corner, confronting Dr. Mason and the colleague he was speaking to. But then she remembered her mother's words from the night before. "You can't control how others see you, but you can control how you see yourself." Swallowing hard, Grace straightened her shoulders and walked in the opposite direction. She headed towards the pediatric ward, determined to lose herself in her work. Throughout the day, Grace threw herself into her duties with renewed vigor. She checked on patients, changed IVs, and comforted worried parents. But beneath her calm exterior, Dr. Mason's words echoed relentlessly. As she sat at the nurse's station during her break, Grace found her hands trembling as she tried to fill out a patient's chart. The constant stress of enduring such treatment day after day was wearing on her. She felt a heaviness in her chest, a tightness that made it hard to breathe. A young nurse named Martha noticed Grace's distress. "Are you okay?" she asked softly, placing a gentle hand on Grace's shoulder. Grace managed a weak smile. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. But inside, she was far from fine. The toll of constantly proving herself, of rising above the prejudice, was becoming almost unbearable. The next morning, Grace woke up to the gentle rays of sunlight peeking through her curtains. It was her day off, a much-needed respite from the relentless stress at the hospital. She stretched lazily in bed, savoring the quiet moment before starting her day. After a leisurely breakfast, Grace decided to run a quick errand to the grocery store. As she drove, her mind wandered to the challenges she faced at work. The constant tension, the hurtful remarks, the daily struggle to maintain her dignity, it all weighed heavily on her heart. Pulling into the parking lot, Grace took a deep breath. "Today is about relaxing," she reminded herself softly. She grabbed a card and entered the store, determined to focus on the simple task at hand. As she walked down the aisles, Grace found herself gradually unwinding. The familiar routine of selecting fruits and vegetables, checking expiration dates, and comparing prices provided a soothing rhythm to her thoughts. Here, away from the pressures of the hospital, she could just be Grace, not Nurse Harper, not the target of Dr. Mason's prejudice, just Grace. In the cereal aisle, Grace paused to consider her options. A small smile played on her lips as she remembered her father's fondness for sugary cereals, a trait she'd inherited despite her medical training. She reached for a colorful box, allowing herself this small indulgence. As she shopped, Grace found her thoughts drifting to more pleasant topics. She thought about the family dinner planned for the weekend, the new book waiting for her at home, and the small garden she'd been tending on her balcony. These simple joys, often overshadowed by work stress, now shone brightly in her mind. At the checkout, Grace exchanged pleasantries with the cashier, her natural warmth and kindness shining through. It felt good to interact with someone without the underlying tension she often experienced at work. Loading the groceries into her car, Grace felt a sense of calm settle over her. The everyday task had grounded her, reminding her of the life she had outside the hospital walls. As Grace finished loading her groceries into the trunk of her car, a loud crash shattered the peaceful afternoon. The sound of screeching tires and crunching metal filled the air, sending a chill down her spine. Without hesitation, she slammed her trunk shut and spun around, her eyes scanning the parking lot for the source of the commotion. Just beyond the edge of the lot, she saw a horrific sight. A small red car had collided with a streetlight, its front end crumpled like an accordion. Smoke billowed from the hood, and shards of glass littered the pavement. Grace's heart raced as her nursing instincts kicked in. She sprinted towards the wreckage, her mind already running through emergency protocols. As she approached the mangled vehicle, she could see a figure slumped over the steering wheel. "Hello, can you hear me?" Grace called out, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. There was no response. Carefully, she made her way to the driver's side door, which was bent but not completely jammed. With a firm tug, she managed to wrench it open. Inside, she found a teenage boy, unconscious and trapped by the twisted metal of the car's interior. Grace's training took over as she quickly assessed the situation. The boy's chest was rising and falling, a good sign, but a nasty gash on his forehead was bleeding profusely. His left leg was pinned beneath the crumpled dashboard, and Grace knew better than to try and move him. "It's okay, sweetie," she murmured, even though she knew he couldn't hear her. "Help is on the way." She heard sirens in the distance, growing louder by the second. Grace knew that every moment counted. She reached into the car, careful not to disturb the boy's position, and gently felt for his pulse. It was there, but weak and erratic. Grace knew she couldn't wait for the paramedics. The smoke billowing from the car's hood was growing thicker, and a faint smell of gasoline filled the air. Her heart pounded in her chest as she realized the danger they were in. "I've got to get you out of here, sweetheart," she whispered to the unconscious boy. With strength she didn't know she possessed, Grace carefully maneuvered her arms around the teenager's torso, She took a deep breath and pulled, feeling the metal groan as it released its grip on the boy's leg. Inch by inch, she eased him out of the wreckage, her muscles screaming in protest. Finally, she managed to drag him a safe distance away from the smoking vehicle. Grace gently laid him on the ground, her trained eyes quickly assessing his condition. He wasn't breathing. Without hesitation, Grace tilted the boy's head back and began CPR. "Come on, sweetie," she urged as she started chest compressions. "Stay with me." Around her, a small crowd had gathered. Some people had their phones out, filming the scene, while others stood frozen in shock. But Grace didn't notice any of them. Her world had narrowed to the rhythm of her hands on the boy's chest and the count in her head. 1, 2, 3, 4. She paused to give 2 rescue breaths, watching the boy's chest rise and fall with each one. Then back to compressions. "Someone call 911, she shouted, not breaking her rhythm. The minutes felt like hours as Grace continued her efforts. Sweat beaded on her forehead, and her arms ached, but she refused to give up. In the distance, she could hear sirens growing louder. Suddenly, the boy gasped and coughed. Grace quickly turned him on his side as he sputtered and took in ragged breaths. Relief washed over her like a tidal wave. "That's it, honey," she soothed, rubbing his back gently. "You're okay. Just keep breathing." As the ambulance pulled up, Grace finally allowed herself to look around. The crowd was cheering and clapping, their faces a mix of awe and relief. But Grace's focus remained on the boy, whose eyes were now fluttering open. The paramedics rushed onto the scene, their equipment in hand. Grace, still kneeling beside the boy, quickly briefed them on his condition. "He was unconscious when I pulled him out," she explained, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "I performed CPR for about 5 minutes before he started breathing on his own." The lead paramedic nodded, impressed. "You did great, ma'am. We'll take it from here." As they loaded the boy onto a stretcher, Grace felt a sudden reluctance to leave his side. She had fought so hard to keep him alive. She couldn't bear the thought of not knowing if he'd be okay. "I'm a nurse at St. Mary's," she said, her decision made in an instant. "I'd like to ride along if that's all right." The paramedics agreed, and soon Grace found herself in the back of the ambulance, holding the boy's hand as they sped towards the hospital. The vehicle's siren wailed, a constant reminder of the urgency of their situation. Grace watched the boy's chest rise and fall, silently willing him to keep fighting. She hadn't even realized she was praying until she heard herself whisper, "Please, God, let him be okay." As they neared the hospital, the boy stirred slightly. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and confused. "It's all right, sweetheart," Grace soothed, squeezing his hand gently. "You're safe. We're taking you to the hospital." The boy's lips moved, trying to form words. Grace leaned in closer to hear him. My dad?" he mumbled weakly. "We'll find your dad," Grace assured him. "Don't worry. Just rest now." The ambulance pulled up to the emergency entrance of St. Mary's Hospital. As the back doors swung open, Grace was hit with a wave of déjà vu. She had walked through these doors countless times, but never quite like this. The paramedics rushed the stretcher out, rattling off the boy's vitals to the waiting emergency team. Grace followed closely behind, her hand still clasped around the boy's. As they wheeled him through the familiar corridors, Grace's mind remained focused solely on the young life she had saved. She had no idea of the profound impact this day would have on her own life, or how it would change her relationship with the very hospital she called her second home. Grace stepped back as the emergency room doctors took over, her hands trembling slightly as she released the boy's hand. She watched them wheel him away, her heart heavy with concern. The bustling activity of the ER faded into the background as she found herself alone in the waiting area. Sinking into a chair, Grace let out a deep breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. The events of the day washed over her like a tidal wave. Just hours ago, she had been grocery shopping, trying to enjoy her day off. Now here she was, covered in dirt and sweat, waiting anxiously for news about a boy she'd pulled from a wrecked car. Her mind replayed the scene in the parking lot, the sound of screeching tires, the acrid smell of smoke, the fear in the boy's eyes when he briefly regained consciousness. Grace's training had kicked in automatically, but now that the adrenaline was wearing off, she felt utterly drained. "Please let him be okay," she whispered, closing her eyes. As she sat there, Grace's emotions swirled like a storm. She was exhausted, her muscles aching from the physical strain of the rescue. But more than that, she felt a deep, gnawing worry for the boy. She didn't even know his name, yet she felt responsible for him. Grace looked down at her hands, still dirty from the accident scene. She had held this boy's life in these hands. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on her shoulders. A nurse walked by, giving Grace a curious look. It wasn't often they saw one of their own sitting in the waiting area, especially looking so disheveled. Grace managed a weak smile, but her mind was elsewhere. She wondered about the boy's family. Were they on their way? Did they know what had happened? Grace's heart ached thinking about how worried they must be. She knew all too well the fear and helplessness that came with having a loved one in the hospital. As the minutes ticked by, Grace's concern grew. She found herself straining to hear any news, any update about the boy's condition. But the ER remained frustratingly quiet, at least regarding her young patient. As Grace sat in the waiting area, lost in her thoughts, a flurry of activity suddenly erupted around her. She looked up to see a team of doctors and nurses rushing past, pushing a gurney. Her heart skipped a beat when she recognized the boy from the accident. "We need to get him into surgery now," one of the doctors shouted. Without hesitation, Grace sprang to her feet. Her exhaustion forgotten, she fell in step with the medical team. "I can help," she said, her voice steady and determined. The lead doctor glanced at her, taking in her disheveled appearance. Recognition flashed in his eyes. "Nurse Harper? We could use your assistance." Grace nodded, her professional demeanor taking over. She quickly washed up and donned a fresh set of scrubs. Within minutes, she was back in the familiar rhythm of the emergency department, her focus entirely on the young patient. As they prepped the boy for surgery, Grace's mind raced. She knew every second counted. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, attaching monitors and adjusting IVs. The boy's pale face tugged at her heart, reminding her of why she became a nurse in the first place. Meanwhile, just a few doors down, Dr. Andrew Mason stood over an operating table, completely oblivious to the drama unfolding so close by. His skilled hands worked with precision as he performed a delicate procedure. The operating room was silent except for the steady beep of monitors and Dr. Mason's occasional commands to his team. Back in the ER, Grace helped stabilize the boy before he was wheeled into surgery. As the doors swung shut behind him, she sent up a silent prayer. She knew she had done everything she could, but the outcome was now in the hands of the surgical team. Grace took a deep breath, steadying herself. There were other patients who needed her attention. She pushed her worry for the boy to the back of her mind and turned to the next case, ready to face whatever challenges the night might bring. Dr. Mason stepped back from the operating table, a satisfied smile hidden behind his surgical mask. He had just completed another successful procedure, further cementing his reputation as one of the hospital's top surgeons. "Excellent work, everyone," he said, his voice carrying the usual note of superiority. "As always, I expect a full report on my desk by morning." As he began to peel off his surgical gloves, a nurse burst into the room, her face pale and eyes wide. "Dr. Mason," she exclaimed, her voice trembling. "You're needed immediately. It's your son." The color drained from Dr. Mason's face. "Luke, what about Luke?" he demanded, his usual composure cracking. "There's been an accident," the nurse replied softly. "He's in surgery now." Dr. Mason's world tilted on its axis. Without another word, he pushed past the nurse and rushed out of the operating room, leaving his bewildered team behind. His feet pounded against the polished hospital floors as he raced through the corridors. Staff members and patients alike stared in shock as the normally dignified Dr. Mason flew past them, his face a mask of terror and desperation. "Where is he?" Dr. Mason shouted at a startled nurse as he reached the surgical wing. "Where's my son?" The nurse pointed towards one of the operating rooms and Dr. Mason bolted towards it. He was about to burst through the doors when a colleague grabbed his arm. "Andrew, you can't go in there," the doctor said firmly. "The surgical team is doing everything they can. Dr. Mason's legs gave out, and he slumped against the wall. His hands shook as he ran them through his hair. How did this happen?" he whispered, his voice cracking. As the reality of the situation sank in, Dr. Mason's usual arrogance melted away, replaced by raw, unfiltered fear. The hospital staff watched in stunned silence as the man they had always seen as untouchable broke down before their eyes. Dr. Mason burst into the emergency room, his eyes wild with fear. His usual composed demeanor was gone, replaced by the raw panic of a father terrified for his child's life. He scanned the room frantically, his heart pounding in his chest. Then he saw him. Luke lay motionless on the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to various machines. Dr. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he rushed to his son's side. "Luke," he whispered, his voice breaking. "Oh, Luke." As he reached for his son's hand, Dr. Mason noticed someone else in the room. Standing on the other side of the bed was Grace, her face etched with concern as she monitored Luke's vital signs. For a moment, Dr. Mason froze. The nurse he had belittled and humiliated countless times was now standing watch over his precious son. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him, but he pushed the thought aside, focusing solely on Luke. "Is he okay now?" Dr. Mason asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace looked up, meeting Dr. Mason's eyes. There was no hatred or resentment in her gaze, only compassion. "He's stable now, Dr. Mason," she said softly. "The surgery went well, and we're monitoring him closely." Dr. Mason nodded, unable to speak. He gently squeezed Luke's hand, willing his son to wake up. "You should know," Grace continued, her voice steady, "that Luke is here because of a car accident. I was there when it happened. I pulled him from the wreck and performed CPR until the ambulance arrived." The weight of her words hit Dr. Mason like a ton of bricks. He looked at Grace, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. The nurse he had treated so poorly, the woman he had deemed unworthy of his respect, had saved his son's life. The room fell silent, save for the steady beep of the heart monitor. Dr. Mason stood there, his hand still holding Luke's, as he grappled with the enormity of the situation. The tension in the air was palpable as the doctor struggled to reconcile his prejudices with the reality before him. The silence in the room was deafening. Dr. Mason stood frozen, his hand still gripping Luke's, as he stared at Grace with a mixture of disbelief and shame. The usual arrogance that defined his demeanor had vanished, replaced by a look of utter bewilderment. Grace, ever the professional, continued her work. She checked Luke's IV, adjusted his oxygen levels, and made notes on his chart. Her movements were fluid and practiced, a stark contrast to Dr. Mason's rigid posture. I don't understand," Dr. Mason finally stammered, his voice barely audible. The words seemed to catch in his throat, as if he couldn't quite believe what was happening. Grace looked up from her task, her eyes meeting Dr. Mason's. There was no judgment in her gaze, only a calm determination to do her job. "What don't you understand, Dr. Mason?" she asked gently. Dr. Mason's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. How could he explain that his entire worldview had just been shattered? That the woman he had belittled and dismissed for so long was now the reason his son was alive? The beeping of the heart monitor filled the silence between them. Dr. Mason's eyes darted from Grace to Luke and back again, as if trying to make sense of this new reality. "You saved him," he finally managed to say, his voice cracking with emotion. "After everything you saved my son." Grace nodded softly, her focus never wavering from Luke. "It's my job, Dr. Mason. It's what I do." Those simple words hit Dr. Mason like a physical blow. He stumbled back slightly, overwhelmed by the weight of his own prejudice and the magnitude of Grace's compassion. In that moment, Dr. Mason's world turned upside down. Everything he thought he knew, every assumption he had made, crumbled away. He was left standing there, humbled and shaken, as Grace continued to care for his son with the same dedication and skill she had always shown, despite his treatment of her. As the emotional scene unfolded in Luke's hospital room, the door burst open. A woman with tear-stained cheeks rushed in, her eyes wild with worry. It was Minda Mason, Dr. Mason's wife and Luke's mother. "Oh, my baby," she cried, hurrying to Luke's bedside. She grasped his hand, her shoulders shaking with sobs of relief as she saw her son alive and breathing. Dr. Mason, still reeling from his earlier realization, stepped back to make room for his wife. Minda's gaze fell on Grace, who stood quietly nearby, still tending to Luke's needs. Are you the nurse who saved our son?" Minda asked, her voice trembling. Grace nodded softly. "Yes, ma'am. I'm Nurse Grace Harper." Without warning, Minda threw her arms around Grace, enveloping her in a tight embrace. "Thank you," she sobbed, her tears soaking into Grace's scrubs. "Thank you for saving our Luke. We can never repay you for what you've done." Grace, though taken aback by the sudden show of affection, gently returned the hug. "It's okay, Mrs. Mason. I'm just glad I could help." Dr. Mason watched the scene unfold, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled to find words. The guilt that had been building since he first saw Grace by Luke's bedside now threatened to overwhelm him. I don't," he stammered, his usual eloquence abandoning him. How could he express the storm of emotions raging inside him? The gratitude for his son's life, the shame of his past behavior, the awe at Grace's unwavering compassion. Grace met his gaze over Minda's shoulder, her eyes filled with understanding but devoid of judgment. She remained calm and composed, a steady presence in the midst of the Masons' emotional turmoil. Minda finally released Grace from her embrace, wiping her eyes. "How can we ever thank you enough?" she asked, her voice thick with emotion. Grace smiled gently, her focus returning to Luke. "Seeing Luke recover will be thanks enough, Mrs. Mason. That's all that matters now." As the hours ticked by, Luke underwent a battery of tests and treatments. The medical team worked tirelessly, their efforts building upon the foundation of Grace's quick thinking and expert care at the accident scene. Slowly but surely, Luke's condition began to stabilize. Dr. Mason and Minda remained by their son's bedside, their faces etched with worry and exhaustion. Grace continued to check on Luke regularly, her gentle presence a constant comfort to the family. In the corridors of the hospital, whispers began to circulate among the staff. Nurses huddled together during their breaks, their voices low but filled with a mix of awe and disbelief. "Did you hear?" one nurse said to another. "Grace Harper saved Dr. Mason's son." "No way," her colleague replied, eyes wide. "The same Dr. Mason who's always giving her such a hard time?" A passing doctor chimed in, shaking his head. "Talk about irony. The nurse he's been tormenting for months just saved his kid's life." The news spread like wildfire through the hospital. Staff members who had witnessed Dr. Mason's past behavior toward Grace couldn't help but marvel at the turn of events. Some felt a sense of justice, while others hoped this might lead to a change in the doctor's attitude. In the cafeteria, a group of interns discussed the situation in hushed tones. "I can't imagine how Dr. Mason must feel right now," one of them mused. "Yeah," another agreed. "To owe everything to someone you've treated so poorly, it's got to be eating him up inside." As the day wore on, the irony of the situation became impossible to ignore. The very nurse Dr. Mason had belittled and underestimated had become his son's savior. It was a powerful reminder that compassion and skill knew no boundaries, and that judging others based on prejudice could have unforeseen consequences. Dr. Mason sat in a chair beside Luke's hospital bed, his head in his hands. The steady beep of the heart monitor was a constant reminder of how close he had come to losing his son. As he looked up at Luke's sleeping face, a wave of guilt washed over him, threatening to drown him in shame. His mind raced back through the months of cruel comments and dismissive glances he had thrown Grace's way. Every snide remark, every time he had belittled her in front of colleagues, every moment he had made her feel less than. It all came crashing down on him now. "What have I done?" he whispered to himself, his voice barely audible. He thought about Grace's unwavering professionalism, how she had always carried herself with dignity despite his constant attempts to tear her down. And now, she had saved Luke's life without a second thought, without knowing who he was. Dr. Mason's chest tightened as he confronted the ugly truth of his prejudices. He had judged Grace solely based on her background, never giving her a chance to prove her worth. He had allowed his ingrained biases to cloud his judgment, to make him treat a skilled and compassionate nurse as if she were beneath him. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on him. The very person he had deemed unworthy had become his family's savior. Dr. Mason felt a deep sense of shame wash over him as he realized how wrong he had been, how his prejudices had blinded him to Grace's true value as both a professional and a human being. As he sat there grappling with his internal conflict, Dr. Mason knew that he had a long way to go to make things right. The road to redemption would be difficult, but as he looked at his son, alive thanks to Grace's actions, he knew it was a journey he had to take. Dr. Mason took a deep breath, steeling himself as he approached Grace at the nurse's station. His hands were clammy and his heart raced. This was unfamiliar territory for him, and he felt completely out of his element. "Nurse Harper," he said, his voice uncharacteristically shaky. "May I have a word with you?" Grace looked up from her paperwork, her face a mask of professional neutrality. "Of course, Dr. Mason. Is this about Luke's condition?" Dr. Mason cleared his throat. "Well, no. I mean, yes, partly, but I wanted to—" He fumbled for words, his usual eloquence deserting him. "I wanted to thank you for what you did, and to apologize for my behavior." Grace's expression didn't change. She simply nodded and said, "I appreciate that, Dr. Mason. Now, about Luke's latest test results." Dr. Mason blinked, thrown off by her redirection. "Oh yes, of course. But I really need to say—" "Dr. Mason," Grace interrupted gently but firmly, "Luke's recovery is the priority right now. Let's focus on that." Flustered, Dr. Mason nodded. "You're right, of course. What do the results show?" As Grace began explaining Luke's improving vitals and next steps in his treatment plan, Dr. Mason found himself marveling at her composure. Here she was, carrying on as if he hadn't spent months making her work life miserable. Her dedication to her job and to Luke's care was unwavering. Throughout their conversation, Dr. Mason made several more awkward attempts to express his remorse. Each time, Grace smoothly steered the discussion back to Luke's medical needs. Her professionalism never wavered, even as Dr. Mason struggled to find the right words. As their interaction came to an end, Dr. Mason felt a mix of frustration and admiration. He hadn't been able to properly apologize, but Grace's focus on what truly mattered, his son's health, spoke volumes about her character. "Thank you, Nurse Harper," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything." Grace simply nodded. "I'll be back to check on Luke in an hour. Please let me know if you need anything before then." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Dr. Mason to reflect on the long journey ahead of him to make things right. As the days passed, Luke's condition steadily improved. The hospital room that had once been filled with beeping machines and worried whispers now echoed with soft laughter and quiet conversations. Dr. Mason spent every moment he could by his son's bedside, his usual busy schedule set aside for the first time in years. Grace continued to care for Luke with her trademark compassion and skill. Each time she entered the room, Dr. Mason felt a pang of guilt and admiration. He watched as she gently checked Luke's vitals, her movements efficient yet tender. "How are you feeling today, Luke?" Grace asked, her warm smile lighting up the room. "Better, thanks to you," Luke replied, his voice still weak but filled with gratitude. Dr. Mason nodded in agreement, his eyes meeting Grace's for a brief moment before she looked away. The tension between them was still there, a tangible thing that seemed to fill the air whenever they were in the same room. As Lukey's recovery progressed, the change in Dr. Mason became more and more apparent to those around him. The once stern surgeon now spoke softly, his sharp edges dulled by the humbling experience. Nurses who had once scurried out of his way now found him approachable, even kind. "I hardly recognize him," one nurse whispered to another as they watched Dr. Mason help Luke take a few shaky steps down the hospital corridor. His family, too, noticed the difference. Mrs. Mason watched her husband with a mixture of surprise and relief, seeing a gentleness in him that had been buried for far too long. "Andrew," she said one evening as they sat by Luke's bedside, "I think this experience has changed you." Dr. Mason looked at his sleeping son, then at his wife. "It has," he admitted softly, "and I have a lot to make right." His gaze drifted to the door, where Grace was just entering for her evening rounds. The air in the room seemed to thicken, the unspoken words between them hanging heavy in the silence. Yet, there was a glimmer of something new in Dr. Mason's eyes, a hope for reconciliation, a desire to make amends. The next morning, Dr. Mason arrived at the hospital earlier than usual. His eyes were rimmed with dark circles, evidence of a sleepless night spent wrestling with his conscience. He paced the quiet hallway, waiting for Grace to arrive for her shift. When he saw her approaching, Dr. Mason took a deep breath and called out, "Nurse Harper, may I speak with you privately?" Grace paused, her face a mask of professional neutrality. She nodded and followed him into an empty consultation room. Once inside, Dr. Mason's carefully rehearsed speech evaporated. He stood there, struggling to find the right words. "Finelli," he spoke, his voice thick with emotion. "Grace, I've been so wrong. About everything." His eyes welled up with tears. "The way I've treated you, the things I've said, they're unforgivable." Grace remained silent, her calm gaze fixed on him. Dr. Mason continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. "You saved my son's life. You, the very person I've belittled and mistreated for so long. I can't even begin to express my gratitude or my shame." His composure crumbled and he wiped at his eyes with trembling hands. "I'm sorry, Grace. I'm so deeply, truly sorry. For everything. You've shown me what true strength and compassion look like. I've been blind and I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I need you to know how sorry I am." Grace listened intently, her expression softening slightly but remaining composed. When Dr. Mason finished, she took a moment before responding. "Thank you for your apology, Dr. Mason," she said, her voice steady and calm. "I appreciate your honesty and sincerity. I did what any healthcare professional would do for Luke, and I'm glad he's recovering well." Her measured response left Dr. Mason feeling both relieved and humbled. He nodded, understanding that his words alone couldn't undo years of hurt, but hoping they were a start. As Grace left the consultation room, her mind still processing Dr. Mason's apology, she noticed a familiar figure approaching. It was Dr. Mason's wife, her eyes puffy from crying, but her face filled with gratitude. "Nurse Harper," she called out softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Grace nodded, offering a gentle smile. "Of course, Mrs. Mason. How can I help you?" Mrs. Mason took a deep breath, trying to compose herself. "I wanted to thank you again, properly this time. What you did for Luke, for our family, it's beyond words." She reached out and grasped Grace's hands in her own, squeezing them tightly. "You're a hero, Grace. A true hero. Our family will never forget what you did." Grace felt a lump form in her throat, but she maintained her calm demeanor. "I'm just glad I was there to help, Mrs. Mason. Luke is a strong young man, and I'm so happy he's recovering well." Mrs. Mason's eyes welled up with fresh tears. "It's not just about saving Luke's life, though that alone is more than we could ever repay. It's about how you did it, with such selflessness and courage. And even after, the way you've carried yourself with such dignity." She trailed off, overcome with emotion. Grace gently squeezed her hands back, offering silent support. The two women stood there for a moment, sharing a quiet but profound connection. Grace's humility and compassion shone through, even in the face of such overwhelming gratitude. "Thank you," Mrs. Mason whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for being the person you are, Grace. You've changed our lives in more ways than you know." Grace nodded, her own eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm honored to have been able to help, Mrs. Mason. Luke's recovery is all the thanks I need." In the days that followed, a noticeable change swept through the hospital corridors. Dr. Mason, once known for his cold demeanor and harsh words, began to transform before everyone's eyes. The staff watched in amazement as the renowned surgeon's attitude shifted dramatically. One morning, as Grace was checking on Luke's vital signs, Dr. Mason entered the room. Instead of his usual brusque manner, he greeted her with a warm smile. "Good morning, Nurse Harper. How's our patient doing today?" Grace blinked in surprise but quickly recovered. "Good morning, Dr. Mason. Luke's vitals are stable and he's showing signs of improvement." Dr. Mason nodded, his eyes filled with genuine appreciation. "Excellent work, as always. Thank you for your dedication." The change didn't stop there. In staff meetings, Dr. Mason began acknowledging the contributions of all team members, regardless of their position. He listened attentively to suggestions and encouraged open dialogue. During a particularly challenging surgery, Dr. Mason surprised everyone by praising the entire team's efforts. "Outstanding work, everyone. Nurse Harper, your quick thinking was crucial. We couldn't have done it without you." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It was a far cry from the belittling comments she had grown accustomed to. As the weeks passed, Dr. Mason's newfound respect extended beyond Grace. He began advocating for better treatment of all employees, regardless of their background or position. In a meeting with hospital administration, he passionately argued for more inclusive policies. "We need to create an environment where every staff member feels valued and respected," he stated firmly. "Our strength lies in our diversity, and it's time we recognize that." The hospital staff watched in awe as Dr. Mason, once feared for his harsh critiques, became a champion for equality and respect. His transformation touched everyone, creating a ripple effect of positivity throughout the entire hospital. Grace continued her work at the hospital, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The corridors that once echoed with whispers of Dr. Mason's harsh treatment now buzzed with a new energy. Her colleagues, who had previously watched her struggles in silent sympathy, now looked at her with undisguised admiration. As Grace made her rounds, she noticed the change in how people interacted with her. Doctors sought her opinion more often, and fellow nurses seemed eager to work alongside her. Even the most timid staff members now greeted her with warm smiles and words of praise. "Grace, you're an inspiration," whispered Sarah, a young nurse, as they worked together on patient charts. "The way you handled everything, it's just amazing." Grace felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "I'm just doing my job, Sarah, nothing special." But deep down, Grace couldn't deny the sense of personal justice that washed over her. Dr. Mason's transformation was evident to everyone. He now walked the halls with a humbler demeanor, treating all staff members with respect and kindness. One afternoon, as Grace was checking on a patient, she overheard two doctors talking in the hallway. "Have you noticed how different Dr. Mason is lately?" one said. "It's like night and day," the other replied. "I never thought I'd see him advocating for diversity training and inclusive policies." Grace allowed herself a small smile as she continued her work. She remained focused on her duties, never letting the newfound admiration go to her head. Her patients were still her top priority, and she approached each task with the same dedication and compassion she always had. Yet, as she moved through her day, Grace couldn't help but feel a quiet sense of vindication. The hospital that had once been a place of daily struggle now felt like a community where she truly belonged. Dr. Mason's change of heart had not only impacted him, but had created a ripple effect throughout the entire staff. As the weeks passed, Dr. Mason's transformation continued to surprise everyone at the hospital. One day, he approached Grace as she was finishing her shift, his demeanor a far cry from the arrogant surgeon he once was. "Nurse Harper," he said, his voice hesitant. "Do you have a moment?" Grace nodded, curious but wary. "Of course, Dr. Mason. What can I do for you?" Dr. Mason took a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about how to make real changes here at the hospital. The board has approved a new initiative to promote diversity and inclusivity in the workplace. And, well, I'd like you to be a part of it." Grace's eyes widened in surprise. She hadn't expected this. "Me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Dr. Mason nodded. "Yes, you. I know I have a lot to learn, and I can't think of anyone better to help guide this initiative. Your strength, your compassion, your ability to rise above, you're exactly what we need." Grace felt a mix of emotions wash over her. Part of her wanted to jump at the opportunity, to be at the forefront of positive change. But another part hesitated, remembering the pain and humiliation she had endured. I don't know what to say, Dr. Mason," she replied, her voice wavering slightly. Dr. Mason's eyes softened. "I understand if you're hesitant, Grace. I haven't given you any reason to trust me in the past, but I'm asking for your help now, not just for me, but for everyone who works here. We can create a better environment for all, and your input would be invaluable." Grace took a moment to consider his words. She thought about all the other nurses and staff members who might benefit from this initiative. She thought about the future of the hospital and the potential for real, lasting change. Finally, she looked up at Dr. Mason and nodded. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll do it, but I want to make sure this isn't just for show. We need to make real changes." Dr. Mason's face lit up with relief and gratitude. "Absolutely, Grace. That's exactly what I want too. Thank you. Thank you so much." As Dr. Mason walked away, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready to face the challenge. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she could truly make a difference at the hospital. The hospital buzzed with excitement as the new Diversity and Inclusivity Initiative launched. Grace stood at the podium, her voice clear and strong as she addressed the gathered staff. "Today we begin a new chapter at our hospital," she said, her eyes scanning the crowd. "A chapter where every voice is heard, every person is valued, and every contribution is recognized." As Grace spoke, Dr. Mason stood to the side, nodding in agreement. The change in him was evident to everyone present. Gone was the arrogant surgeon who had once belittled Grace. In his place stood a man humbled by experience and determined to make amends. Over the next few weeks, Grace led workshops and training sessions. Her leadership skills shone brightly as she guided discussions on unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and creating a respectful workplace. Her calm demeanor and insightful approach inspired her colleagues to open up and engage in honest conversations. Dr. Mason, true to his word, became a vocal advocate for the initiative. He shared his own journey of transformation, admitting his past mistakes and encouraging others to examine their own biases. "I was blind to my own prejudices," he confessed during one session. "But thanks to Nurse Harper's incredible act of kindness and professionalism, my eyes have been opened. We all have the capacity to change and grow." Grace's efforts began to bear fruit. Slowly but surely, the hospital's atmosphere started to shift. Nurses from diverse backgrounds felt more comfortable speaking up in meetings. Doctors sought out different perspectives when making decisions. The change was palpable. One day, as Grace was reviewing some feedback forms from a recent workshop, Dr. Mason knocked on her office door. "Come in," she called out. Dr. Mason entered, a smile on his face. "Grace, I just wanted to say how impressed I am with everything you're doing. The impact you're having on this hospital is remarkable." Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you, Dr. Mason, but it's not just me. Everyone is putting in the effort to make this work." The annual hospital gala was in full swing. The grand ballroom sparkled with elegant decorations, and the air buzzed with excited chatter. Doctors, nurses, and administrative staff mingled, dressed in their finest attire. Dr. Mason stepped up to the podium, his usually confident demeanor tinged with nervousness. The room fell silent as he cleared his throat. "Good evening, everyone," he began, his voice slightly shaky. "I stand before you tonight not just as a doctor, but as a man who has been profoundly changed." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Grace. She stood near the back, looking surprised at the sudden attention. "Many of you know Nurse Grace Harper," Dr. Mason continued, "but what you may not know is that she saved my son's life." A collective gasp rippled through the audience. Dr. Mason went on to recount the day of the accident, his voice thick with emotion as he described Grace's heroic actions. "Grace didn't know it was my son she was saving," he said. "She acted with the same compassion and skill she shows every patient every day." Tears glistened in Dr. Mason's eyes as he continued. "But Grace didn't just save my son, she saved me too. She opened my eyes to the prejudices I had harbored for far too long." The room was silent, hanging on every word. Many in the audience dabbed at their eyes, moved by the raw honesty of Dr. Mason's speech. "I had treated Grace unfairly, belittled her, and made her work life difficult," he admitted, his voice cracking. "And yet, when the moment came, she didn't hesitate to save my child. Her actions showed me the true meaning of compassion and professionalism." Dr. Mason's gaze found Grace again. She stood still, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Grace," he said, addressing her directly, "I can never thank you enough for what you've done. You've not only saved my son, but have also helped me become a better person, a better doctor, and a better leader." The audience broke into applause, many rising to their feet. Grace remained rooted to her spot, overwhelmed by the moment. As the applause died down, Grace made her way through the crowd, accepting handshakes and warm smiles from her colleagues. The atmosphere in the hospital had shifted dramatically since Dr. Mason's public apology and the launch of the new diversity initiative. In the weeks that followed, the impact of Grace's actions and Dr. Mason's transformation rippled through every department. Nurses who had once been afraid to speak up now felt empowered to share their ideas. Doctors who had previously kept to themselves began engaging more with their colleagues, regardless of their position or background. The initiative, spearheaded by Grace and supported wholeheartedly by Dr. Mason, brought about tangible changes. Diversity training became mandatory for all staff members, and open forums were held regularly to discuss issues of equality and inclusivity. One morning, as Grace walked into the hospital lobby, she noticed a new bulletin board. It was filled with colorful notes from staff members sharing stories of kindness and support they had experienced or witnessed. She smiled, recognizing that this small gesture was a sign of the bigger changes taking place. In the cafeteria, Grace overheard a group of interns discussing a challenging case. To her surprise, Dr. Mason joined their table, listening intently and offering guidance without a hint of his former condescension. The interns' faces lit up, clearly appreciating the chance to learn from the renowned surgeon in such a supportive environment. Later that day, Grace attended a department meeting where ideas were flowing freely. Nurses, doctors, and support staff all contributed equally, their suggestions met with respect and consideration. The sense of unity was palpable, a stark contrast to the tense hierarchical meetings of the past. As she left the meeting, Grace bumped into Sarah, a fellow nurse who had always been too shy to speak up. "Can you believe how different things are now?" Sarah said, her eyes bright with excitement. "I actually look forward to coming to work these days. It feels like we're all part of one big team." Grace nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. "It's amazing what can happen when people come together and treat each other with kindness and respect," she replied. As Grace walked through the hospital corridors, she couldn't help but marvel at the transformation that had taken place. The once hostile environment had blossomed into a place of respect and collaboration. She paused by a window, gazing out at the bustling city below, and allowed herself a moment to reflect on the journey that had brought her here. Memories of Dr. Mason's cruel remarks echoed in her mind, but they no longer held the sting they once did. Instead, they served as a reminder of how far they had all come. Grace remembered the countless times she had bitten her tongue, choosing to rise above the prejudice rather than sink to its level. A small smile played on her lips as she recalled the day she had saved Luke Mason's life. It was a pivotal moment that had changed everything, not just for her, but for the entire hospital. The image of Dr. Mason's face, torn between gratitude and shame, was etched in her memory. Grace's heart swelled with pride as she thought about the diversity initiative she now led. It wasn't just about her anymore. It was about creating a better workplace for everyone. She had become a beacon of hope for those who had felt voiceless and undervalued. As she continued her rounds, Grace overheard snippets of conversation. Doctors and nurses from different backgrounds sharing ideas, supporting each other. It was music to her ears. She knew that the fight for equality wasn't over, but the progress they had made was undeniable. A young nurse approached Grace, her eyes shining with admiration. "Nurse Harper," she said softly, "I just wanted to thank you. Your strength, it's inspired me to speak up and be proud of who I am." Grace placed a gentle hand on the nurse's shoulder. "We all have that strength within us," she replied warmly. "Sometimes it just takes a little courage to let it shine." As the nurse walked away with a renewed sense of confidence, Grace felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Her quiet strength had indeed become an example to others, a living testament to the power of resilience and compassion. Dr. Mason stood at the nurse's station, his eyes scanning the bustling corridor. When he spotted Grace, his face softened with a mixture of admiration and remorse. He took a deep breath and approached her, his usual confident stride replaced by a more humble gait. "Nurse Harper," he said softly, catching her attention. "Do you have a moment?" Grace looked up from her charts, her expression calm and professional. "Of course, Dr. Mason. How can I help you?" Dr. Mason gestured to a quiet corner, and they moved away from the busy hallway. He cleared his throat, his eyes meeting hers with sincerity. "Grace, I know I've said this before, but I want you to know how truly grateful I am for everything you've done," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "Not just for saving Luke's life, but for showing me a better way to live and work." Grace listened attentively, her face a picture of composure. Dr. Mason continued, his words coming more freely now. "Your strength, your professionalism in the face of my inexcusable behavior. It changed me, Grace. It changed how I see everything." He paused, running a hand through his graying hair. "I used to think I had all the answers, that my way was the only way. But watching you, seeing how you handle yourself with such grace and dignity, it opened my eyes." Dr. Mason's voice lowered, filled with a mixture of awe and regret. "You've taught me more about respect and equality than any seminar or book ever could. Your actions, your unwavering commitment to your patients and your colleagues, it's made me realize how narrow-minded I've been." Grace's expression softened slightly, touched by the sincerity in Dr. Mason's words. He continued, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I want you to know that I'm committed to continuing this journey. The changes we're making in the hospital, they're just the beginning. I'm learning every day thanks to you, and I promise to keep working on myself and advocating for others." The hospital's grand conference room buzzed with excitement as staff members from every department gathered for the celebration. Colorful banners hung from the walls, proclaiming, "Embracing diversity, celebrating unity." At the front of the room, Grace Harper and Dr. Andrew Mason stood side by side, a sight that would have been unthinkable just months ago. Dr. Mason stepped up to the microphone, his face beaming with pride. "Today, we celebrate not just the success of our diversity initiative, but the incredible woman who made it all possible." He turned to Grace, his eyes filled with respect. "Nurse Harper, your leadership and unwavering commitment to equality have transformed our hospital. You've shown us what true strength looks like." The room erupted in applause, and Grace felt a warmth spread through her chest. She looked out at the sea of faces, seeing genuine smiles and nods of appreciation. As the applause died down, various staff members stood up to share their stories. A young intern, her voice trembling with emotion, spoke up. "Before the initiative, I was afraid to speak up when I saw unfair treatment. But Nurse Harper taught me that my voice matters. Now I feel empowered to advocate for myself and others." An older doctor nearing retirement shared his experience. "I've been set in my ways for decades," he admitted. "But Grace's patience and kindness helped me see the value in embracing change. She's taught this old dog some new tricks." Laughter rippled through the room, and Grace felt her eyes misting over. She hadn't realized just how much impact her actions had made. A nurse from the pediatric ward stood up next. "Grace has always been a beacon of hope in our hospital," she said, her voice filled with admiration. "But seeing her work alongside Dr. Mason to create real change, It's inspired all of us to be better, to do better. As more stories poured in, it became clear that the hospital's culture had shifted dramatically. Where once there had been tension and unspoken resentment, now there was open communication and mutual respect. The diversity initiative had done more than just change policies. It had changed hearts and minds. As the stories of transformation and growth continued to fill the room, Grace felt overwhelmed by the impact of their collective efforts. She glanced at Dr. Mason, who stood beside her with a look of genuine pride and humility on his face. Their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. Dr. Mason stepped forward once more, his voice thick with emotion. "I stand here today not just as a doctor, but as a changed man," he said, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Grace Harper taught me the true meaning of compassion and professionalism. She saved my son's life, and in doing so, she saved me from my own prejudices." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes as Dr. Mason turned to face her directly. "Nurse Harper," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I can never fully express my gratitude for what you've done. You've shown me that kindness and empathy can overcome even the deepest divides. Thank you for not giving up on me, and for helping me become a better person." The room fell silent as Grace stepped forward to shake Dr. Mason's hand. As their hands clasped, the audience burst into applause, many wiping tears from their eyes. It was a moment of profound respect and mutual understanding, a testament to how far they had both come. Looking out at the sea of faces, nurses, doctors, administrative staff, all united in their commitment to equality and respect, Grace felt a surge of hope. She realized that their journey was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted and were already bearing fruit. As the celebration continued around them, Grace and Dr. Mason shared a quiet moment. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" Grace said softly. Dr. Mason nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We have," he replied, "and we'll keep moving forward." If you enjoyed the story of Nurse Grace and Dr. Mason, I handpicked this next story that will touch your heart. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.